Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And again, I welcome everyone. Bryce and Camden, you both are so wonderful, and I know that everybody enjoyed every element of what you did today, how well you did it, and how thoughtful your speeches were. In fact, your speeches were so good, I thought, what am I going to say now? Because the two of you and Rabbi Sussman and myself, we're all touching on the same idea that's in the Torah, but I think we all bring a little bit of a different perspective to it, so tune in. I'm coming to the end of my active preaching as the rabbi here at B'nai Torah. I do know a number of things, and one is I want to continue to teach Torah. But more specifically, I want to be able to communicate the message and values that come from Torah. I guess, and for those of you that have been here over the years, you know that's my bent. That's what I want Torah to do, to be a value statement of the Jewish people. You see, and you may remember hearing me say this before, the Torah came to our people as a revolutionary text. It teaches things that were not previously known in the ancient Near East, or perhaps known to humanity. It brings ideas and values for people in the human condition that is meant to bring freedom to those without and to uplift the spirit of the human being. Our God is a God of freedom, and that is central to our thinking about human beings and human life. Recognizing the inherent holiness that exists in every human being, and the holiness that can exist in a land and a place, and the holiness that exists in time, these were all revolutionary ideas. And although some of our ideas were formulated as a response to our exile and the oppressive emperors that existed in the places we lived and around us, we held on to the notions that reflect the dignity of every human being, and the realization that one of life's greatest challenges will be and will always be how people live when they attain power after having been slaves. How will our people respond to power? Central to our tradition was an opposition, as you know, to idolatry. And idolatry was found in the worship of things, of possessions, of people, of leaders and kings that used their wealth and armies to oppress and to control, as if they were gods. Our tradition began with the notion that we were to become a people based on two concepts that evolved over thousands of years of conversation and interpretation and clarification. And those concepts were introduced to Abraham, Tzedek, and Mishpat. Tzedek, not only as the essence of tzedakah, an obligatory charity, but as the essence of righteousness and kindness in human behavior. And Mishpat understood as justice, freedom, human equality, and dignity would never be fulfilled without justice. And justice is to be understood through a system of law that would provide for fairness and consideration to be offered to every human being. Rooted deeply in our text is this understanding that all people are created in the image of God. Rooted in our concept of justice is that justice needs to be offered equally to every man and woman and child, no matter who they are, where they're from, or what language they speak, or what their ethnicity is. I know you knew before this week that habeas corpus came from a 13th century British law. But its values are also essentially a part of the justice that emanates from a Torah much earlier that said all people, rich and poor, stand equally before the law. Do you know why there are specified tzitzit on a Jewish man's garment or talit? And on the tzitzit there was to be a patil techelet, the fringes. fringes, a patil techelet, a thread of blue. We learned from a very well-known and brilliant Jewish anthropologist named Jacob Milgram that it's because all ancient Near Eastern people wore robes. And the robes often had fringes, and fringes differed according to one's social status. The color of the fringe, whether there were jewels on the fringe. But in our culture, we were taught everyone was to wear the same fringe. There wasn't to be a differentiation based on wealth or power, with a thread of blue. And it was to indicate that everyone stood before God as equals. And as I mentioned, the concept of freedom is central. The concept of justice is what enabled freedom to be protected. The dignity of the human being, the preciousness and ultimate value of human life is at the core of Jewish law because it comes from the ultimate lawgiver. God is the ultimate other, truly never fully known and certainly not fully understood, but respected through his Torah and known through his people in terms of the way they lived, but never represented by a person. I have no doubt that although I teach such ideas, we don't always reach them as a people. We may have aspirations and ideals and goals, but we're not always there, and so we continue to strive. And perhaps that's why one of the fundamental values of human life and human behavior is another idea. And it's one that anyone who comes to Shul on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah knows. Or for that matter, anyone who pays attention to the Amidah twice, 3 times a day. The idea is teshuvah. Teshuvah is a notion that we always have to be looking at ourselves and evaluating ourselves and our own behaviors. We can't always be pointing fingers at others as the cause of what it is we are going through. We have to look at ourselves. We have a responsibility not only in what we do, but what happens to us. And sometimes we're so blinded by our own pain and our own anxieties and our own trauma that we excuse our behaviors and blame them on others. So considering something from this week's Torah and looking at the Parsha, from this week's news, and looking at the Parsha specifically, I was reminded of another element of our revolution. Early on in the Parsha, there are 2 really interesting laws that you've heard about a few times this morning. And they are reflected of much broader concepts and can be seen beyond the plain reading in the text. First, there was the laws that regulate what's known as the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year. The people were told that for 6 years they could sow their fields and prune their vineyards, but during the 7th year the land was to be given complete rest. The land was given a Shabbat. And second, every 50th year was a Jubilee year, in which land and vineyards were not to be worked, and in which liberty was to be granted to all those who were enslaved during the previous 49 years. It marked a return to any property that was purchased during the 49 years to the original families who had been given the land at that time. They were able to regain their land. The sabbatical year in many ways is consistent with 2 other laws that we know. One is called Shechicha, and the other is referenced as Peyot. Peyot means corners. I'll get to them in a minute. So what's revolutionary here? Well, I had always thought that the sabbatical year was a year that made great agricultural sense. That's why it was given. Crops, when grown on land year after year, absorb the nutrients that are most important for the crop. And that's why farmers would rotate their crops. And this is all obviously in pre-industrial farming. So Shemitah made great agricultural sense. The other laws regarding the land had to do with forgotten sheaves, crops which were not harvested as the farmer plowed along. But the farmer was not allowed to return and collect those crops. Peyot, are the corners of the field left unharvested. And these are all acts of charity for the poor. At night, hungry and poor people would go on the land, and they would take the crops left behind. And they were able to gather food from the corners of the fields also, the food that wasn't harvested. And they could do so, and they could retain their dignity. Interestingly, the Torah, which tends to be specific about size, makes no reference at all to how large the corner of the field should be. Apparently a nod to a person's capacity to be generous. So taken together, those two, with the Shemitah, there's another lesson that's of great importance. And this is my main point. The lesson is the following. Ultimately, man does not own the land. It is God who has ownership of the world. And we are here as tenants. Our job is to plant and reap and feed and benefit from that work which we do. But like people, the land has this Shabbat, and it indicates that we don't have supreme power. We might want to get more and more and more from the land, but we're told we can't. As you said, Camden, even the land has to rest, and there's importance in the rest. But the law creates the sense that we are subservient to a power that cannot be seen. The law is telling us that we have to impose limitation on what we gather. And the law is telling us that we have to be humble. We can't own it all. We can't have more and more and more. There is a difference between our needs and our desires. It's a law that indicates this difference and how obsessive we can become to obtain more. I once told this story. I love the story. It's about the first Dutch settlers in what is now the island of Manhattan. They wanted to buy the land from the indigenous tribes who were living there. And according to the story, the Native Americans found it so entertaining that they laughed at the thought that they could sell this land. How could they? How could they possibly, even though they had settled the land and had lived on the land? It didn't belong to them. They believed that the land belonged to God. When land ownership becomes the focus of our lives, we become idolatrous. And this is true with all things. And we live in a world where things are so worshiped and influence comes from ownership, and we are consumed by it. Material possessions and land ownership, we think wrongly, measures our worth. That's not what our worth is about. At the end of each and every wedding, every Jewish wedding, I teach the following before the groom breaks the glass. You know, there are traditional reasons for this act. It's a reminder of our exile and the destruction of our land in Jerusalem from the past. And we never forget that, even at glorious times. And of course, there's superstitious notions that come with breaking glasses at joyous times. But I say, in addition to those, there's a more important idea for our times. Because you are living in the most materialistic of times. The glass will be shattered. It will never be whole again. And so it teaches us not to depend on our happiness from our things. Our happiness will come from our love, from our spirit, from the spiritual lives that we find, and in our learning and understanding. Similarly with the Jubilee and the remission of debt and the liberation given to those who have been enslaved. It's a law that comes from God in the Torah. It's also a law about the limitations of our ownership and our power. The Torah teaches that God puts those limits on us. And it's considered to be an act of tikkun olam. You know the word tikkun olam. typically translated as repairing the world. But it means something else in rabbinic literature. It means keeping the world in balance. Left to our own devices or their own devices, some human beings will become wealthier than Rothschild, and others will fall into dire poverty. That's the nature of people. But our tradition says that we have to keep things in balance because greed will consume human beings in a way that will destroy every society. What an incredible notion brought by a Torah of 3,000 years ago. And how amazing is it that it remains alive to this day and perhaps is as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago. The Torah teaches when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. And it instructs that the land doesn't belong to you. You're strangers, you're residents, God says. It's for you to care for. This is the origins of the concept that we call social justice. In the politics of our nation today, and much of the world, social justice has become a divisive issue. It may be hard for you to believe this, because it was hard for me to believe it. But I have had a number of people speak to me scornfully over the last few years, saying that I speak too much about social justice. That's not their concern. But I know when I read the Torah and I study the words of the prophets, social justice is an essential component of our teachings and the values. Simply put, to be Jewish is to believe in social justice. In relation to economic policies, social justice, immigration, the exclusion of others in our society, I know that many of you, like me, have been thinking about the fact that there's disregard for the lives of the most vulnerable. There's a disregard for the impact of policy on individuals. And we don't think of what they go through as a function of some greater understanding. But the individual has always been at the core of Jewish sensitivities and Jewish law. Just this past week, Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary, was not even able to define habeas corpus in a congressional hearing. Imagine. Because of those laws that she was involved in putting forward, people didn't have a right to due process, taking away this law from the 1300s. Well, thankfully, my elementary school history course taught me about habeas corpus and the rights of individuals and the limitations of the powerful taking advantage of the powerless. And so it clearly defined one of the great challenges to our values which exist in the world today. If we don't understand that power has to be limited, that wealth cannot be in the hands of a few, that individuals have a right to due process and need to be protected under the law, we'll find ourselves in a history that's like the social and cultural history of the early 1800s, or thousands of years before that. And then the values that define decency and create refinement in culture will be lost. But along comes this reading. And we're reminded that our appetites need to be controlled, that our power needs to be limited, that our concern for other human beings must be expansive and always growing. And then we'll work together, l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to improve this world, to balance this world under the kingship of God. that only takes humility. It takes the ability to see ourselves as part of something that's greater than any one of us, and the realization of some very basic values, tzedek and mishpat, righteousness and justice. I take these words so seriously, and I know you do too. We cannot lose hope. We have to retain our connection to that which is most essential. And so we'll come back and we'll read this parsha again next year. And once again, we will be reminded of what we own and how much we should own and how important humility is in the human condition. Remember, what is most important, Saint Exupéry taught, is invisible to our eyes. But deep in our hearts and in our souls and on our minds, we know what's most important. And we can remind ourselves, and will continually remind ourselves through this Torah of ours. And when we see that, perhaps in some small way, we'll do our job and raise our voices to create some harmony in this world. Shabbat Shalom.